What's good, YouTube, and welcome back to the channel. We are here going over a crossover breaker pre YCS Anaheim tier list. These are just my initial thoughts after a couple of weeks of testing the new decks, testing the matchups versus each other and versus existing decks already in the format. And these are just my opinions of what to expect going into YCS Anaheim. Obviously, a lot can change from now till YCS Anaheim, and we can have different things happen than what I predict. But this, in general, is just my general prediction of how the meta is going to look going into YCS Anaheim. So if you like videos like these, definitely make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel for more competitive Yu-Gi-Oh content. So first things first, we're going to start with Fire King Snake Eye. I think Fire King Snake Eye is still one of, if not the best deck. It's either the first or second best deck of the format. The ability to still use the Snake Eye engine, cards like Flameberg Dragon, the Diabell Star cards, Deception, having access to Omni Negates is the big deal. The Fire King cards helping you push going second into boards and just giving you versatile and layered disruption against other decks in the meta. I just think that Fire King is an overall solid deck and definitely has answers to different things that people are going to be doing in the meta. So I would say that it is definitely the front runner going into YCS Anaheim. The next deck I wanted to discuss by that same Snake Eye angle is the pure Snake Eye deck. I think that the pure Snake Eye deck is definitely a tier below the Fire King Snake Eye deck. I don't think it's as good. I think it's more of a glass cannon deck, but it still has access to those powerful tools in the form of Flamber Dragon and the Azamina engine. But instead of the Fire King engine, you're opting to play more non-engine, and some people even opting to play cards like the Kashtira engine as a supplementary engine instead of the Fire King engine. But I do feel that the deck is just all around worse than the Fire King version of the deck, but it still is a solid deck going into the next format. I want to just bust out all of the existing decks before we start talking about the new decks. So the next deck I'll talk about is Tenpai. I think that Tenpai is definitely, at the current moment, the second best, if not the best deck, in my opinion, in the format. I think that Tenpai is the best deck in the format, next to Fire King. However, with the introduction of crossover breakers, we're getting new decks that aren't super affected by Dimensional Shifter, which definitely hurts some of the strength of Tenpai, along with everyone who is already, a lot of people are already playing Dimensional Barrier as a one-of with Thrust, but we can even be seeing 6 copies of Dimensional Barrier in the side, depending on how hard people want to go in order to try to beat the Rizal deck, because that deck is a mono Xyz deck, so they're automatically weak to a card like Dimensional Barrier. So I think with those things in mind, Tenpai is definitely going to get a lot worse going into the next format. The next deck that I wanted to talk about was Yugioh. I think that Yugioh is still at full power. It's 100% at full power. The only thing is the hand traps are getting really good at dealing with these super aggressive combo decks. Cards like Pirellia were already good against the deck. Then with Rage of the Abyss, we got Fuwaros, which kind of was a nail in the coffin, per se, for the deck being the best deck, because the deck was the best deck, definitely pre-Rage of the Abyss. It was the best deck by far. But it's kind of taking a hit in the competitive scene, and it's kind of slowed down a little bit, just because of the hand traps being so good against it. Under Fuwaros, in order to get to really anything, you're giving your opponent 2 to 3 draws, and you're ending on a very subpar board. It just, the deck, there are a lot of other better options out right now than Yubel, but I do still think that Yubel is a top tier deck and one to definitely be aware of going into Anaheim. The next deck I wanted to talk about is Centurion. For Centurion, I'll put it in the Rogue tier. I think that Centurion, after the initial hype has kind of died down, we kind of could sit back and really analyze the deck. And while it was impressive with Pat going undefeated in Swiss at YCS Niagara, even him, he's not really playing the deck anymore. A lot of people have moved on to other options, and the deck has seen a big drop in its play. While a lot of people are still playing the deck is definitely just seeing a lot of play because it's a safe option into a Tenpai dominant meta, and a meta dominated by decks that are very weak to decks that play a lot of hand traps and low engine. Low engine and a lot of hand traps is really good right now against some of the Snake Eye variants. and Centurion is a deck that really just defines that. But with Crossover Breaker, we're going to get better options for decks that want to take that approach. The next deck I want to talk about is Chimera Fiendsmith. I would also put that in the rogue category. A deck that is very powerful going first, has layered disruptions with Diabells and hand ripping with Phantom Beast, Chimera. Yeah, the deck is just a cool deck, but I don't think that it is that amazing, especially going second and with people siding 3 copies of Dimensional Barrier going into the next format. I think is going to get a lot worse for this deck. And some of the new decks being able to play Dimensional Shifter, which this deck is completely terrible into Dimensional Shifter. And Droll is going to see a lot more play in the next format. I just don't think it's a very good time for Chimera as a deck. The next deck that is sort of seeing a little bit of hype right now is Mermail. This is the first deck I'll put into the tier 2 category. I think that Mermail is actually a pretty solid strategy right now. It has a very powerful going first, being able to rip multiple cards out the opponent's hand and set up multiple Totally Awesomes. And it's going second. It's able to play some of the more powerful hand traps in the game via Impulse, the more Charmies, and post side being able to search cards like Spooky Dogwood is kind of interesting. I do think that this deck does suffer from people not having enough time to really map out everything that this deck is capable of. This deck is kind of low-key. We don't see like a lot of the super high tier players really talking about it, except for Kamal. Shout out to Kamal. He just recently topped with it. But this deck isn't really seeing a lot of discussion, but it's definitely a solid deck. The next deck I want to talk about is Runic variants in general. I would say that Runic variants in general are definitely rogue right now. The best one being Runic Whitewood. On the last ban list, we saw Skill Drain go to 1, which was a big part of this deck being able to remove its own Skill Drain and add it back with Diabells, etc., etc. I just think that Runic really takes advantage of a low ceiling format where board breakers are good, but that is not where we are right now. But in the future, Runic is a deck that, as long as Runic Fountain is at multiple and we still have multiple Runic tips, the deck will go up and down the tier list depending on how the format is and once the format settles. The next deck is Labyrinth. Labyrinth is a deck that I put in the tier 2 category. Labyrinth isn't really seeing a lot of play right now, but I do think with Crossover Breakers coming up, people might try to play Labyrinth as a counter to Rizal. Just because it's a deck that can search a Dimensional Barrier, and then against the Snake Eye decks you can search a card like DDG, and just a lot of trap cards is always like a deck that people will try to do in order to stun mid-range decks. But I don't know how effective it is into the Rizal. It's not a matchup I've tested too extensively, but I know that it is something that people have been talking about as a potential counter to the Rizal deck. The next deck that I want to talk about is Ritual Beast. Ritual Beast I'll put at the top of tier 2. If we were talking about current format, I would put it in tier 1.5. I think this deck is pretty good right now. But with Crossover Breaker coming out and Malice coming out, people are going to be siding Lancia. People are already siding Barrier. They're going to be siding more Barrier. And we're just getting more decks that are good into Shifter. So I think all of those reasons just make Ritual Beast get a little bit worse. And I'm fine bumping it down a tier on the tier list. It also is a deck that is pretty unexplored. And by that, I mean not a lot of people play this deck. This is a deck that maybe 5, 6, 7, 10 people will enter a tournament with. But it usually goes pretty deep in the tournament, deep into Top Cut. Because the people who play this deck are very dedicated to this deck. But it's just not a deck that a lot of people play. Similar to some other decks that we're going to talk about, which is the next deck, which is Memento. Memento is another deck that I will put into the tier 2 category. I honestly think that this deck is very, very good and super unexplored. And I do think that it is a better deck than Ritual Beast. But it's just a deck that no one plays. There are certain people that play this. This deck is a cult classic. Shout out to Eva. Shout out to Snot. People like that. They have whole documents just dedicated to combo lines for this deck. 20, 30-page documents just dedicated to their love for Memento. But Memento is not a very popular deck. It's just a deck that aesthetically, which does matter to a lot of people, it's just not very pleasing to look at. And it's very complicated. It's a very complicated deck. It's a deck that I personally have tested a lot, and it was the deck that I was potentially going to play for YCS Niagara, but I changed last minute. it does struggle a little bit against Dimensional Shifter and Tenpai, but other than that, I thought that the deck was excellent. Um, but with more decks coming to the format that could potentially use Shifter, and this deck, honestly, surprisingly, is a little bit weak to Dimensional Barrier. You would think that because of Combined Creation being the boss monster, you don't care. But actually, when you're going second into a board and your opponent debarriers you for Fusion, you do kind of care. Not being able to get to your Creation King and get to your Twin Dragon does hurt sometimes. It also makes Sheepy a really weird card. So with all that being said, I'm going to put it here for now, but from the OCG, we see that this deck has consistently been rising in popularity because of its Rizal matchup. So maybe we can see this deck move up on the tier list if it proves to be a good counter to the Rizal deck. The next deck we have here is a deck that has no success, but potentially we'll see play going into the upcoming format, and that's Goblin Biker Fiendsmith. I'll put it here at the bottom of tier 2 for now, but because I have high expectations for this deck as a pure Rizal counter deck, just a complete Rizal counter deck. For those who aren't familiar with the Goblin Biker theme, they are a bunch of level 3 monsters. It's an Xyz deck, and what they do is they can special summon themselves from your hand and summon them from your graveyard as quick effects by detaching material from an Xyz monster on the board. So, against Rizal, it's an Xyz deck. You're just detaching material, getting rid of their interaction, and summoning bodies onto the board, which search cards and get you more card advantage. It's a pretty interesting deck, and I've tested it. Or I haven't tested it. I've tested against it as a person playing Rizal, and it is kind of annoying to play against, and it is a pretty scary matchup. But I do have high expectations for this deck, depending on how many people end up on the Rizal deck. And how popular it ends up being. This deck will probably just get better and better. The next deck I want to talk about is Millennium. We'll put Millennium in casual, and that's not a bad thing. I wanted to include this deck because I do like this deck. I think that it's cool that Konami created an Exodia deck. It's a very iconic card, and the deck functions as in it can win games, and it has an actual win condition. It's not just like a random pile of cards. And I think that that's cool to help older players try to transition back into the competitive scene and just get more people into the competitive scene. Like, oh, I can play Blue Eyes White Dragon in my deck, and it's a good monster in the deck, and it's not really Blue Eyes, and I can play Exodia and attack for game and play cards like Exodia Obliterate, but it's a casual deck. It's a deck that you bring to locals or bring to a regional and get an invite with. It's cool, but it's not necessarily the greatest deck. The next deck is Rescue Ace. Rescue Ace is another deck that I would put about here. It's another rogue deck. A deck that, while its win condition is still powerful, being Turbulence, the deck has aged a bit. It has hits on the ban list. Airlifter is at 1. Also, the deck just doesn't have a great Fire King matchup at all. It struggles going second into decks like Yugioh because the deck can't play a lot of non-engine. But it is a deck that potentially, depending on how things go, can move up on the tier list. I know a lot of people were hyped for the deck going into Rage of the Abyss because they thought it was a good deck to beat Furos, because your main win condition is in the main deck and you can kind of play around Furos by just summoning Turbulence and setting 4. But it didn't really pan out like that. The deck did top Niagara, but it hasn't really seen too much success since. Now for the new decks. Let's get one out the way, which is Yugioh. I'll put this in casual for now. I definitely have to do more research on this deck, but from what I've read and from the results I've seen in the OCG, no one is talking about this deck. No one is talking about this deck. The cards themselves seem fairly interesting, and they seem like they give you a lot of card advantage with the Pendulum Monster. However, it does seem like an engine that's supposed to be splashed into Dinosaur, Winged Beast, and Sea Serpent decks. So maybe if we get a good Dinosaur, Winged Beast, or Sea Serpent deck that wants level 10 monsters or has synergy with this, then we can talk about it. But until then, I think that this is something that maybe you should pick up and just hold on to. And then, depending on the legacy support that they give for this archetype, we can see some movement in the tier list. Now for the two new big hitters, which are the two new decks on the block. The first one we'll talk about is Malice. Malice, I will put here at the top of 1.5. I do not think that Malice is a tier 1 deck. I think that this deck's weakness in Lancia is too big of a weakness. Being able to get hit by Lancia when you go first or second is really, really rough. At least with like Ryzel, you only have to worry about D-Bear when your opponent is going first, and that's about it. But with Malice, even when I'm going first, I can get Lancia post side. And then if they have a half board and Lancia me, sometimes those games are just unwinnable when you get Lancia. It really feels hard to win those games. And this deck also has a surprisingly bad Ryzel matchup, just engine to engine. It doesn't seem Malice favored at all. It seems like very Ryzel favored. So with all those things being said, I don't think that the deck is bad by any means. I do think that people will have success with the deck, but I think we have to wait till further support down the line, which we've already seen for Duelist Insight. That's when I think this deck will really pop off, but until then, I think that this deck is like a 1.5, and it might even go lower as we get more results. But I do have high hopes that maybe someone smarter than myself finds out something better to do than what I've found. And I like this deck. I'm personally a huge Malice fanboy. I like this deck way more than I like Ryzel, honestly. But it just pains me to see that I don't think that it's necessarily the greatest deck for competitive Yu-Gi-Oh right now, or if you want to do extremely well at the YCS level. But I will definitely be playing this deck on stream a lot, and I'll definitely be playing this deck at regionals or at locals. I'm definitely going to pick up the cards and try to max this deck out. I love this deck a lot. And the last deck is Ryzel. Ryzel is a easy tier 1 next to Fire King. It is the best deck of the format, if not the second best. I'm still not sure which is better, Fire King or Ryzel. I'm leaning more towards Ryzel being the best deck, but just for safety, I will continue to have Fire King as the best deck of the format, just because Fire King doesn't have some of the issues that Ryzel has when it comes to consistency, which Ryzel's consistency is not bad at the moment. It's just not as good as it could be because we're missing support cards. And then obviously Snake Eye decks do not have the D-Barrier issue that Ryzel has, which D-Barrier is just like, I can make a whole video about that, or not really, it's very short. D-Barrier is crazy against this deck. If you get D-Barriered, you're not doing much engine-wise. You're just gaining card advantage, but it's not turning into interruption or interaction on the opponent's next turn. You're just gaining card advantage and hoping your hand traps get you there to the next turn. But other than that, this deck is excellent. When it goes first, it plays through multiple hand traps. You get to multiple disruptions. Detonator is a hell of a card. You just sit on a Detonator, and you're able to check pretty much every other deck on this tier list with just one monster, being able to interact with 3-4 cards, and then you have the field spell as a monster negate. It's a really cool deck, and I expected to see a lot of play for Anaheim, and it's probably my deck that I predict to win the event. But with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace, and have a great day.